Have you ever heard a voice so honest and soulful that it could make an entire room feel like a Sunday service, even on a weekday afternoon? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a stage bathed in warm light, a slender figure taking position before the microphone. There's a ripple of anticipation in the audience, an almost spiritual hush. And then his voice pours out, gentle but firm, urging hope and empathy, calling for justice. It's unlike anything you've heard. That voice belonged to Curtis Mayfield, a brilliant singer, songwriter, and composer who dedicated his life to translating struggle into song, turning personal and political realities into uplifting anthems that shaped a generation. Today we're venturing into the heartfelt story of this music legend, walking through the winding roads of his childhood, examining the heartbreaks and triumphs that painted his journey, and uncovering seldom discussed moments that reveal not only his soul, but also the soul of an era. Growing up on Chicago's North Side in the 1940s and 1950s, Curtis Lee Mayfield found himself part of a rapidly changing American landscape. The city's momentum was built on waves of the Great Migration, as African American families sought better opportunities outside the segregated South. Many, including Curtis's own family, settled into neighborhoods riddled with the complexities of both hope and hardship. Even as the bustle of Chicago promised new beginnings, there were daily reminders of poverty, prejudice, and the steep climb toward equality. The sonic background of his childhood was thick with gospel tunes, the rhythmic hum of the city, and the comforting presence of strong women in his life, particularly his mother and grandmother. Those influences would become vital threads in the tapestry of his music. His mother, who juggled multiple jobs, did everything she could to keep her family afloat after Curtis's father left. She insisted on self-reliance, personal dignity, and the power of one's own spiritual faith, values that shaped Curtis's worldview from a young age. But it was Curtis's grandmother who introduced him to gospel music in the churches of Chicago, a realm where the lines between faith, sorrow, and jubilation were blurred by the deep, resonant voices of church choirs. Even as a small boy, he seemed drawn to that dramatic tension between lament and praise, heartbreak and hope. Each Sunday, he would watch older choir members belt out songs that spoke of deliverance, faith, and a better tomorrow. An affectionate childhood memory rarely mentioned in mainstream write-ups reveals how at only 7 years old, he would stand on a makeshift platform in his grandmother's living room, singing lyrics he pieced together from hymns he'd heard hours earlier in church. Family members recount how young Curtis's face glowed with a kind of wonder, as if he were possessed by the spirit of the music he heard. This unwavering passion for a song's message, even more than its melody, set him apart from other kids his age. He soon fell in love with the simple acoustic guitar, an instrument he often saw traveling musicians use while busking on Chicago's sidewalks. There was a little thrift store near his neighborhood where, according to one seldom-cited anecdote from a family friend, Curtis would loiter just to stare at a battered second-hand guitar displayed in the window. The store owner, noticing his devotion, eventually let him hold it. From the moment Curtis strummed those steel strings, something magical happened. He had no formal training. He had no official teacher. Nonetheless, he learned to coax tender chords from that guitar by ear, experimenting with tunings that matched the gospel harmonies echoing in his mind. Sometimes he'd lock himself away for hours in a tiny bedroom, trying to replicate complex chord progressions he heard in local church songs or on the radio. Neighborhood kids often teased him for his obsession, but nothing deterred him. That single second-hand guitar became both an escape from the harsh realities of city life and a tool through which he discovered his own creative instincts. By the late 1950s, rock and roll was booming, and soul music was poised to reshape the American soundscape. Curtis, still in his teens, took an unusual path. While many of his peers pursued normal teenage rights, like going to high school dances or jockeying for part-time jobs, he was focused almost solely on developing his musical talents. When his mother's limited finances forced him to consider dropping out of high school, Curtis turned wholeheartedly toward songwriting. Yet he never forgot the spiritual dimension that shaped him. Even in the hustle and bustle of Chicago's evolving R&B clubs, he carried that sense of moral conviction, an unwavering commitment to making music that said something significant, something uplifting, something that transcended mere entertainment. That youthful devotion caught the attention of another budding talent, Jerry Butler. Together, they were part of a group that formed around 1958. Initially called the Roosters, they eventually changed their name to the Impressions. By the early 1960s, the Impressions were well on their way to becoming a force in Chicago's soul scene. Curtis Mayfield, the quietly intense guitarist in the background, soon revealed a gift for songwriting that set him apart from virtually any other musician of his generation. One of their early hits, Gypsy Woman, which Curtis wrote before he turned 20, showcased not only his graceful melodies, but also his knack for weaving tender vulnerability into pop structure. The record gave the Impressions their first real taste of national attention and validated Curtis's belief in the power of heartfelt lyrics. As the 1960s advanced, the Impressions became central to a growing wave of soul music that lifted the civil rights movement's messages and challenges into mainstream consciousness. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders frequently recognized the power of music to unify and galvanize communities for social change. Curtis, while less publicly vocal than some leaders, was determined to deliver that unity through song. For many, the Impressions' discography was the soundtrack to the era's fight for racial justice. Yet behind every success story, there lie personal hardships. Curtis's personal life was a patchwork of demands. The band was always traveling, money was never fully stable, and balancing the rigors of the music industry with family obligations became an ongoing dance. He also found himself wearing multiple hats within the Impressions. He was their primary songwriter, guitarist, and later vocalist. With success came managerial snags. Some early contracts were exploitative, especially for young, emerging black artists in the 1960s, many of whom did not have experienced legal guidance. Curtis understood the precarious nature of those agreements. That understanding would eventually inspire him to launch his own label years later, ensuring creative control and fairer financial arrangements. One of Curtis Mayfield's biggest gifts to the civil rights era, and to music history at large, arrived in 1965 with People Get Ready. If you ask any devout R&B or soul aficionado about the greatest songs of all time, People Get Ready almost invariably makes the list. Often referred to as a gospel-laced masterpiece, the tune feels like an invitation to a higher moral plane, urging unity and readiness for change. Decades later, in an archived interview, Curtis described how the song's origins had come to him in a burst of prayerful reflection, explaining that he wasn't deliberately trying to craft a protest anthem. He was simply channeling the feeling of optimism he witnessed in many civil rights gatherings. The track did become an anthem. Martin Luther King Jr. reportedly praised its message, and the song was played at rallies and marches, sometimes spontaneously sung by protesters as they faced tension or even violent pushback. And behind it all was this quiet, unassuming genius from Chicago, humbly smiling as the world embraced a hymn for social justice. But while People Get Ready soared, Curtis encountered emotional challenges that left lasting impressions. His father's absence, for instance, cast a long shadow over his relationships. Though he rarely addressed this topic publicly, friends recall that he often questioned how differently his life might have gone had he grown up with a more stable paternal figure. Music became his father in a way, the guiding principle that he turned to for advice, comfort, and moral direction. That depth of feeling, the searching quality for guidance, found its way into many of the Impressions tracks, from the tender "I'm So Proud" to the reflective "Keep on Pushing." Audiences responded to that sincerity, and the Impressions became a staple on the pop charts, bridging the gap between mainstream America and the urgent calls for equality echoing throughout Black communities. By the late 1960s, changes within the Impressions and the broader music industry signaled it was time for Curtis to explore new directions. Motown was at its zenith, but it was known for its polished, carefully choreographed style. Curtis admired the pop soul polish of Motown, but sensed a missing piece: songs that spoke more directly to the social issues he and his listeners were experiencing. Ever the visionary, he broke from the Impressions' standard routine and ventured into producing other artists. He worked with names like Gene Chandler and Leroy Hudson, always aiming to accentuate authenticity. Around 1968, after leaving the group for a bit, he discovered a sense of entrepreneurial empowerment in establishing his own label, Curtom Records. That decision was significant. Black ownership in the music business was still fairly rare. With Curtom, Curtis had a platform to explore deeper subject matters, like inner-city struggles, racism, and political unrest, on his own terms. Stepping confidently into a solo career in 1970, he released his self-titled debut album, Curtis, which contained classics like "If There's a Hell Below, We're All Going to Go." The track was unafraid to tackle the complexities of systemic racism, white political apathy, and the pressure Black communities felt under the glare of social upheaval. It struck a chord with listeners looking for music that didn't sugarcoat reality. That same year, on a more personal note, he married Althea, forging a partnership that, by most accounts, offered him a lifeline in an industry that often spins into chaos. People close to them whispered that she was his anchor, someone who brought him emotional stability at a time when his public persona ballooned. At home, he could take off the burden of being a cultural spokesperson and just be a husband, a father, a man continuing to search for peace. In 1972, Curtis brought forth what would become one of the most iconic film soundtracks of all time, Superfly. Blaxploitation films had emerged in the late 60s and early 70s, early 1970s, promising gritty, unvarnished stories of Black life and culture, although in many cases leaning heavily on sensationalized depictions of crime and vice. When he was approached to compose the soundtrack for Superfly, Curtis was both intrigued and cautious. He recognized the potential pitfalls. A film about drug dealers, pimps, and the tough realities of the ghetto could easily be misconstrued as glamorizing drug use or criminal behavior, but he saw an opportunity to address those social ills head-on. His lyrics on Superfly refused to glorify its characters. Instead, they framed them within the inequities and despair plaguing inner-city communities. Songs like Freddie's Dead and Pusherman offered a raw commentary on the cyclical nature of addiction and poverty. Interestingly, a rarely mentioned point is that Curtis insisted on inserting conscious elements into each track, making sure listeners would confront the harsh themes. The commercial success was staggering. Superfly sold millions of copies. It quickly became more than just a soundtrack. It was a statement piece about social injustice and systemic barriers that forced so many Black Americans into desperate circumstances. That soundtrack also triggered controversies. Some commentators claimed Superfly contributed to glamorizing urban crime, with critics pointing to the film's morally ambiguous protagonist. Curtis staunchly defended his work, explaining in an old magazine interview, "I'm not writing jingles to celebrate these lifestyles. I'm showing you a mirror. If you don't like what you see, then maybe we need to fix the reflection." Indeed, his stance highlighted his deeper philosophy. Exposing society's problems could be the first step toward real change. The debate over the film's portrayal of drugs and violence raged on, but it only solidified Curtis's commitment to confronting uncomfortable truths through music. By the mid-1970s, Curtis had settled into a comfortable rhythm. He continued touring, releasing albums that offered a mix of socially conscious themes and tender love songs. Tracks like "We're a Winner" celebrated Black empowerment and pride, while romantic ballads like "So in Love" reminded audiences that tenderness was still a crucial part of the human experience. Balancing these dual identities as both an activist and a crooner, he cultivated a dedicated fan base that extended beyond typical R&B circles. Jazz enthusiasts, rock fans, and even some folk devotees found something resonant in his music. In a lesser-known story from this period, one of his close friends recounted that in times of creative block, Curtis would retreat to a small lakeside cabin near Wisconsin, accessible only by dirt roads. He'd stay there alone, no phone, no distractions, just a guitar, a notebook, and the occasional breeze rolling off the lake. In that solitude, he'd wrestle with the tension between delivering hope to others and confronting the deeper social ills that grieved him personally. While Curtis was ascending to legendary status, R&B and soul music itself was undergoing a transformation. The funk revolution, spearheaded by bands like Parliament Funkadelic, James Brown, and Sly and the Family Stone, reshaped the sonic landscape. Disco was waiting on the horizon. Yet Curtis remained unwavering, forging a path that blended gospel's sense of reverence, R&B's rhythmic backbone, and a lyrical commitment to truth-telling reminiscent of the protest folk songs of the 1960s. Younger musicians often saw him as a sage of sorts, someone who, through melodic grace and lyrical candor, consistently maintained his moral compass. We sometimes forget how many up-and-coming performers from that era, like Donny Hathaway or a young Stevie Wonder, picked up the baton of social consciousness in music after watching Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions. One truly stirring aspect of Curtis's character was his humility. Despite his mounting fame, he never seemed to crave the spotlight for its own sake. In private gatherings, he was more comfortable discussing family life and philosophical questions about faith and justice than basking in praise. Former bandmates note that he always insisted on fair treatment for session musicians, ensuring they got the recognition and compensation they deserved. Rare gestures in an industry known for cutthroat business practices. When asked about his philanthropic activities, he rarely bragged. It came out over time that he donated money to community programs for underprivileged children in Chicago, focusing on music education to empower the next generation of dreamers. As the 1980s arrived, the musical terrain shifted again. Hip-hop began to emerge as a dynamic force, sampling older soul tracks and building new songs atop those bedrock grooves. Curtis Mayfield's voice and guitar riffs found their way into multiple hip-hop tracks, as younger artists recognized the timelessness of his message. Though his commercial popularity waned somewhat in the mainstream, his influence persisted, arguably growing stronger in the hearts of devoted fans. For him, the 80s also brought new personal struggles. he faced health challenges, partly due to years of physically demanding tours and the emotional weight of the issues he tackled, and the broader political climate in the United States, increasing conservatism, and the erosion of social welfare programs brought more friction to his worldview. Yet, if anything, that friction galvanized him to continue writing about systemic inequality, racism, and the enduring necessity of love and compassion. Then came August 13th, 1990, a date that would forever change Curtis Mayfield's life. Performing at an outdoor concert in Brooklyn, he was struck by a lighting rig that collapsed on stage during a gust of wind. The heavy equipment landed directly on him, breaking his spine and paralyzing him from the neck down. The accident was both physically and spiritually devastating. For a musician who had spent decades pouring his soul into the physical act of guitar playing, fingers forming intricate chords, body swaying gently with the music, this was an unimaginable loss of mobility and independence. In an old interview that tends to be overlooked, Curtis, speaking from a wheelchair, offered an astonishingly composed reflection. "My guitar was an extension of my body, but my voice is an extension of my spirit. So long as I have my voice, I'll keep singing." In the face of adversity, Curtis channeled his resilience and faith in a new direction. Though paralyzed, he learned to maneuver a motorized wheelchair and insisted on continuing to compose and record music. A striking lesser-known detail is that for his album New World Order, released in 1996, he recorded vocals lying flat on his back in the studio because of the complications with his lungs and breathing. Each vocal track took incredible effort, and recording sessions had to be paused multiple times so he could catch his breath. Yet, those who were present reported that the spark in his eyes was as potent as ever. He was determined to share whatever remained of his creativity with the world. The resulting album, while not a massive commercial hit, was a triumph of will and an eloquent statement of an artist refusing to be silenced by tragedy. During these final years, Curtis also deepened his commitment to activism. Though he couldn't physically march in demonstrations, he lent his voice and influence to raise awareness on issues ranging from inner-city education to disability rights. Younger generations, introduced to him through samples in hip-hop tracks or references in modern R&B, began discovering the depth of his back catalog. Suddenly, many realized the music that shaped a major slice of American social consciousness came from a man who had turned personal and societal struggles into a timeless testament of hope. Inevitably, there were controversies about the representation of disability in music, as some questioned whether it was exploitative to have Curtis recurred in his weakened condition. Critics and fans debated whether the music industry was truly supportive or whether producers and record executives just wanted to capitalize on his legendary status for one more album. Curtis himself seemed more focused on his mission. If there was still something in his soul that could help, uplift, or inform others, he wanted to share it. A close friend recounted how the singer would light up whenever he got the chance to discuss the unifying power of art, describing it as a kind of universal language that transcends the physical limitations we might face. This philosophy carried him through, up until the end of his life. Curtis Mayfield passed away on December the 26th, 1999, from complications related to diabetes. He was 57, an age that many would say was too soon for a genius who still had melodies left to share. But in that relatively short life, he accomplished more than most could hope for in twice the time. Over the years, he received numerous honors, 2 inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, one with the Impressions in 1991 and one as a solo artist in 1999, a Grammy Legend Award, and numerous lifetime achievement recognitions. Yet for him, the accolades were never the end point. They were merely affirmations that his message touched hearts. The real victory lay in creating songs that left listeners feeling more connected, more empathetic, and more attuned to social responsibility. When we talk about controversies or historical debates concerning Curtis Mayfield, one recurring theme is his stance on activism in music. Some critics argued that his brand of protest was too soft, too couched in spirituality instead of direct political confrontation. Others insisted that his gentle approach actually reached a broader audience, bridging racial divides through melody rather than confrontation. Whichever side one falls on, the debate underscores the broader conversation about how best to affect social change through art. Curtis's measured, hopeful perspective continues to stand as an example of forging progress through compassion, open dialogue, and unwavering moral conviction. Another controversy extends to the conversation about the blaxploitation era. While Superfly undeniably contributed to the commercial success of the genre, some academics assert that despite his best intentions, the film's popularity helped normalize negative stereotypes. Curtis's defenders respond that he infused the soundtrack with messages warning of the pitfalls of drug culture, effectively using the medium to highlight truths that mainstream media had long ignored. Perhaps it's an unresolvable debate, emblematic of how any art addressing real-life violence and poverty can risk portraying or perpetuating stereotypes. But if history is any guide, Curtis Mayfield's contributions lean more toward provoking empathy and awareness, rather than reinforcing harmful tropes. In measuring his historical significance, one must consider not only the number of gold records or chart-topping hits he garnered, but also how his music still resonates with urgent socio-political themes. Music historians often place Curtis Mayfield alongside contemporaries like Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, and James Brown, innovators who reshaped soul and R&B, each in unique ways. Yet Curtis's legacy stands apart for its almost seamless weaving of unwavering faith, social commentary, and uplifting tenderness. When he sang about the daily struggles of Black Americans, it was never meant to wallow in despair. It was to point toward the shining possibility of human empathy. That capacity to inspire is precisely why his story matters. In a culture saturated with sensationalism, he showed that sincerity can carry as much weight as spectacle, and that activism through music doesn't have to mean shouting from the rooftops. It can also mean whispering straight to the human heart. What can we learn from his story today? One lesson is that adversity isn't a dead end. It can be a chance to dig deeper into one's purpose. Another is that quiet persistence, devotion to craft, to truth, to moral responsibility can transform entire cultural landscapes. Curtis Mayfield didn't shout from the rooftops. He wrote steady, compassionate lyrics that cut through prejudice, apathy, and even hopelessness. He made it clear that sometimes a tender melody is more powerful than 1,000 fiery speeches. As we draw to a close, consider the enduring image of Curtis Mayfield, a slender, humble figure clutching his guitar, eyes closed, voice soaring in quiet conviction. Throughout his life, he believed in music as a form of healing, a moral tool, a beacon for the oppressed and the marginalized. Even when he lost the use of his hands, he never lost the desire to use his art to heal and to guide. And in his final years, recording vocals flat on his back, he never let bitterness overshadow his gratitude for life, love, and music itself. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.